They called her a beggar. Right there in front of everyone and in a garden full of roses no one had planted with their own hands. She kept walking, head down, basket on her hip. She had learned a long time ago that dignity costs nothing and means everything. What she hadn't learned, what no one had warned her about, was the man standing in the shadows of that same garden, watching, and deciding in that exact moment that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever seen. Neither of them knew yet what it would cost, or how completely worth it would be. The basket weighed more than it should. It wasn't the first time Adeline Carter had thought that, and it wouldn't be the last. But on that particular morning, with the sun still low over the Mayfair rooftops and the previous night's mud caked to the soles of her boots, the weight seemed to have a personality of its own. Stubborn, deliberately inconvenient. Of course it did. She shifted the basket onto her hip and kept walking. The delivery was for the Pembroke house, one of the largest on the street, with white marble columns that never seemed to get dirty, and a front garden that appeared to exist solely to make every other garden feel ashamed of itself. Adeline knew the route by heart. Side gate, servant's entrance, never the front door, absolutely never the front door, and God help her if anyone from the family spotted her in the wrong hallway. She had learned that the hard way. The side gate was open, as always. Adeline passed through it with the basket on her hip, eyes already fixed on the paved path leading to the back entrance. And then she heard the voices. They were coming from the garden. That wasn't unusual. The daughters of the house often took the morning air out there, accompanied by some friend or visiting cousin, and Adeline could generally pass by completely unnoticed. Head down, quick steps, silent existence. Today, though, the voices were closer. Good Lord, who is that? Adeline didn't stop, didn't slow down. But something in the tone of the question, that specific pitch of someone who isn't asking because they want to know, but because they want everyone to hear, sent heat creeping up the back of her neck. "It's the laundress," answered another voice, with the elaborate boredom of someone who has too much money and too much time. "She comes every week. She looks like a beggar." Laughter. Adeline kept walking, basket on her hip, boots in the mud, the perfect Pembroke garden to her left, full of roses no one had planted with their own hands. "Look at that dress. Is that what they're wearing in the streets now?" More laughter, the kind that doesn't bother trying to hide anything. She was almost at the back entrance. 3 more steps. 2. "Hey!" The voice was direct now, aimed squarely at her. "Didn't you hear us? We're talking to you." Adeline stopped, not because she wanted to, because she had been raised to stop when called, to not cause trouble, to not make anything harder than it already was. There was a very long list of things she did not because she wanted to, but because the world required it. She turned around. There were 3 of them. Young aristocrats in walking hats and immaculate gloves, arranged in the garden like flowers that know exactly what they're worth. The one who had spoken last had golden hair and eyes that assessed everything with the precision of someone taught from an early age that judging people is a natural right. "Do you always make your deliveries dressed like that?" The girl tilted her head, amused. "Or is this a special occasion?" The other 2 laughed. Adeline looked at them, looked at the perfect garden, looked at the roses no one had planted with their own hands. "People see what they want to see," she said, her voice calm. Regardless of the truth, silence for a beat. The golden-haired girl blinked, slightly thrown, not by what had been said, but by the steadiness of it. As if Adeline hadn't understood she was supposed to be embarrassed. "What a strange thing to say," murmured one of the others. Adeline didn't wait for a verdict. She turned, went in through the back door, and left the perfect garden behind. Inside the Pembroke kitchen, she set the basket down on the table with more force than she intended. The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman whose face seemed permanently set in some private worry, looked up from the account books. "Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," said Adeline, and it was a lie, and it was true, and it was the answer she always gave. There was a man in the Pembroke garden, not the front garden, the side garden, the narrow strip of lawn between the main house and the stone wall separating the property from the street. Adeline only saw him when she came out through the back entrance, basket empty now and therefore infinitely more bearable, and the wrong angle nearly brought her straight into him. She stepped back. He didn't. Tall, broad shoulders, a dark coat of impeccable cut that only existed on the backs of men who had never needed to worry about the cost of a coat, light brown hair, slightly dishevelled by the morning wind, brown eyes that looked at her with an expression Adeline needed a moment to identify. It wasn't boredom. It wasn't the kind of look the residents of Mayfair usually gave to people who delivered things to their homes. It was attention. Curious, she thought, and immediately filed the thought somewhere it couldn't cause problems. "Excuse me," she said, stepping aside. "You were in the garden," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, delivered with the quiet tone of someone who had seen everything and was deciding what to do about it. Adeline stopped, because there was something in the way he said it that didn't sound like an accusation. "I was making a delivery," she confirmed, "through the correct entrance." "I know." A pause. Adeline looked at him. He looked at her. The morning wind passed between them as if it had nothing more urgent to attend to. "You were there too," she said, before she could stop herself. "In the garden." Something small happened at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the outline of one, as if he'd started and decided not to finish. "I was," he confirmed. "And what did you see?" The question came out before she could stop it, direct, perhaps too bold for a laundress to aim at a man wearing that coat. Adeline was already bracing for the rebuke when he answered. "3 young ladies being inconveniently well-mannered," he said, "and a woman who handled it with more dignity than the situation deserved." Adeline said nothing. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she hadn't expected that, and when she didn't expect something, she needed a moment to reorganize the world around the surprise. "Thank you," she said finally. "Good afternoon, sir." And she walked away before he could respond, because the alternative was standing in that side garden for too long, looking at a man who had said the right thing in the wrong way. That is, the way that made you want to hear him say more things. She didn't look back. Almost. His name was Bernard Whitmore. She found that out 3 days later, entirely by accident, when Mrs. Hobbs, the Pembroke family's cook, who knew everything about everyone within a 10-block radius, mentioned it without any apparent context, while Adeline waited for her delivery receipt. The Duke of Ashbourne was here on Monday, friend of the eldest son. Always so proper, that one. Pity the season will force him to marry soon. The ladies of high society are already sharpening their knives. Adeline said nothing. Duke. Ah, well, that explained the coat. The social season of 1815 was, by any account, particularly brutal. There was something in the air that year, perhaps the end of the wars, perhaps the nervous prosperity that follows them, perhaps simply the accumulation of families with daughters to marry off and fortunes to protect, that turned every ball, every visit, every public appearance into a battlefield disguised as a ballroom. Mothers assessed, fathers calculated. And the eligible bachelors circulated through events with studied smiles and eyes that tallied up estates. Bernard Whitmore hated all of it, not dramatically. He wasn't given to drama, never had been. It was a functional, practical aversion, the kind you manage with efficiency. He attended events because it was expected, conversed with whom he was supposed to converse, danced when there was no elegant way to refuse, and then left early, with the familiar sensation of having fulfilled an obligation, without feeling anything worth feeling. That particular evening, a ball at the Whitfield house, with more flowers than necessary and fewer open windows than the situation required, he was in the middle of a conversation with Lord Hadley about crop yields when he realized he'd stopped listening. Not out of disrespect, out of distraction. There was something in his line of sight that didn't belong. He looked more carefully. It was a woman near the wall, not exactly hiding, but clearly not participating in the social circulation of the ballroom. A simple ivory muslin dress, without the ornaments the other women wore, brown hair pinned up in a practical way, with a few loose strands that seemed to have made that decision on their own. She was observing the ballroom with the eyes of someone who finds the whole thing simultaneously fascinating and slightly ridiculous. Bernard recognized that expression. It was the same one he felt on his own face every time he tried to discuss crop yields with Lord Hadley. Whitmore. Hadley had stopped talking and was looking at him. "Are you listening?" "Crops," said Bernard automatically. "Yes, completely agree." Hadley seemed satisfied with that, which said something about crops. Bernard looked back toward the corner. The woman had shifted slightly. Now she was closer to the side exit, holding a glass she clearly hadn't touched. And then she turned her face in his direction, and he recognized her. The Pembroke laundress. Not the Pembroke laundress, he corrected himself immediately, with that internal precision that annoyed him sometimes. A woman he had seen at the Pembrokes. A woman who had said something in a garden that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about since. People see what they want to see, regardless of the truth. What was she doing at a Mayfair ball? The answer, as Adeline could have told him if he'd asked, was accompanying Mrs. Belmont. Mrs. Belmont was a widow in her early 60s who lived 3 streets down from the house where Adeline rented her tiny room, who had more money than health, and who had decided about a month ago that Adeline was exactly the kind of young woman who needed opportunities, and that she was exactly the kind of woman who could provide them. "You have presence," Mrs. Belmont had said, with the serene authority of the very wealthy who mistake observations for facts, "and hands marked by hard work. That's character. Come with me to the Whitfield ball this Friday." Adeline had said she didn't have a suitable dress. Mrs. Belmont had solved that problem with the efficiency of someone who knows that problems have solutions, and solutions have a price. And so Adeline Carter, laundress, found herself at a Mayfair ball in a borrowed dress, holding a glass of lemonade she hadn't touched, thinking that this had been, in retrospect, a mistake. Not because the environment was hostile. It hadn't been yet, though the night was young, but because there was something unsettling about being inside that world instead of at the edge of it, looking in from a distance. From the inside, the seams showed. The conversations were more superficial than they'd seemed from afar, and the flowers, God, there were too many flowers, it was almost aggressive. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Belmont's voice at her side carried that specific tone of someone who already knows the answer will be yes regardless of reality. "I'm fine," said Adeline. "Good. Because the Duke of Ashbourne has been looking at you for 3 minutes, and it would be a shame to waste that." Adeline nearly swallowed the lemonade she hadn't touched. "He is not looking at me." "Darling," said Mrs. Belmont with the patience of someone who has seen a great deal, "he is looking at you." Adeline didn't look, refused to look, stared at the excessive flowers with a determination that would have impressed any outside observer. Then she looked. He was looking at her. And when their eyes met, because of course they met because the universe has a very specific sense of humor, he didn't look away. He just kept looking for 1 second longer than was strictly necessary, with that expression she had seen in the Pembroke garden, genuine attention without apparent judgment. Adeline looked away first. Of course she did. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single part. And tell me in the comments, do you think Adeline is going to be able to resist the Duke of Ashbourne? Because I promise you, she is trying, with everything she has. Bernard hadn't planned to speak to her that night. That was the problem with plans. They assumed the circumstances would cooperate. The circumstances that night did not cooperate. What happened was this. He was attempting to leave the ball discreetly and efficiently, as he always did, as he had perfected over years of social practice, when Lady Prescott intercepted him with that specific smile that announced someone was about to be introduced to someone who had not asked to be introduced to anyone. Ashbourne. What luck. Lady Prescott was a woman of inexplicable energy for someone her age. "I simply had to introduce you to my niece, Miss Clarissa, who has just arrived from Bath and is absolutely loving the season." And so Bernard spent 20 minutes hearing about Bath, about the season, and about the comparative merits of various London ballrooms, while his path to the exit grew increasingly blocked by the social choreography Lady Prescott orchestrated with the precision of a general. It was during this period of polite captivity that he saw what happened on the other side of the ballroom. Adeline was near a group of young women, the same type he had seen in the Pembroke garden, interchangeable in their immaculate gloves and bored expressions, and someone in the group said something he couldn't hear. But he saw the effect, the laughter that followed, the gesture in her direction, the way she went very still, like someone deciding between several possible responses and discarding all of them. Bernard excused himself from Lady Prescott with a brevity that would likely be remarked upon. He crossed the ballroom. He hadn't calculated this, hadn't thought about what he would say or do, and he simply found himself on the other side of the room, near the group, before he'd made any conscious decision to be there. "Good evening," he said. to the group in general, but looking at Adeline. The group rearranged itself immediately around his presence. Dukes had that effect in ballrooms. It was a social physics he had long since learned to ignore. But what he had wanted was for her not to be alone in that corner, and that had now happened. Ashbourne. One of the young men, a viscount of something, Bernard couldn't recall the name, extended his hand with enthusiasm. Didn't know you were acquainted with? A microscopic pause. Miss Carter. We met at the Pembrokes, said Bernard, with the ease of someone who isn't inventing anything because he doesn't need to. Miss Carter has a very particular perspective on gardens. Adeline looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name, something between surprise, suspicion, and the outline of something that might become humor if she let it. You're very generous in your description, she said. I'm precise, he corrected. The group around them had gone very quiet in the particular way of people paying close attention while pretending not to. There's an open window over there, Bernard said lightly to her. If you'll allow me. It was an invitation impossible to refuse without appearing rude, and impossible to accept without being noticed by the entire ballroom. Adeline calculated that in under 2 seconds, he could see the calculation happening in her eyes, and then said, As you like. It was the most controlled sentence he had heard in a very long time. The open window led to a small balcony that no one had claimed, probably because the wind outside was sharp and the flowers inside were warmer. Adeline went to the balcony because there was no polite alternative. She stood near the railing with the wind in her hair and the ballroom music muffled behind the glass, and thought that there was a specific cruelty in being pulled out of a difficult situation by someone who created situations that were equally difficult in a completely different way. Thank you, she said, because that was what you said. For what you did in there. I didn't do anything, said Bernard. You stood next to me for 5 minutes while everyone stared. She looked at him. That's not nothing. He considered that for a moment. It should be, he said finally. Normal. Not something to be thanked for. Adeline was quiet. The wind passed between them again with the same lack of urgency as before. Inside, someone had begun to play a waltz, one of the faster ones of the night by the sound of it. What were you doing at the Pembrokes? He asked. Originally, I mean, before the garden. Delivering laundered clothes, she said. No detour, no apology. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. And tonight? Accompanying Mrs. Belmont. Who is... A woman with enough money to have opinions about what's good for other people, said Adeline, and enough kindness to act on them. The corner of his mouth, that outline of a smile that started and didn't finish. Do you always talk like that? Like what? With enough precision to be true and enough ambiguity to be safe. Adeline turned to face him fully. It was a good question, such a good question that she needed a moment to decide what to do with it. When necessary, she said finally. Bernard looked at her for a moment. Not the kind of look that assessed. She knew that one, had received enough of them to recognize it. This was the kind of look that was trying to understand. What's that on your wrist? He asked. Adeline glanced down. A thin, nearly invisible scar she had gotten at 12, trying to fix the metal washtub when the handle broke. She didn't usually bring it up in conversation. Work, she said simply. He said nothing for a moment. Then, do you always carry everything alone? The question arrived strangely, not as an accusation, not as pity, but as genuine curiosity, the kind that wants to understand and doesn't judge what it finds. Adeline felt something she didn't want to feel shift inside her chest, and immediately pressed it back down to where it had come from. When we have no choice, she said, her voice steady, we learn. Silence, the wind, the waltz inside. His brown eyes that didn't look away. That's true, he said finally. And a shame. It doesn't have to be, she answered. Sometimes it's just how things are. Sometimes things are how they are because no one thought to question them. Adeline looked at him for a stretch of time that was undeniably longer than necessary for a conversation between two people who barely knew each other on a cold Mayfair balcony. You're dangerous, she said at last. Why? "Because you talk as if things could be different," she said. "And that is the most dangerous thing there is for someone who has learned to make peace with how they are." He was quiet, and she left, back into the warmth of the ballroom, back to Mrs. Belmont, back to the safe territory of what was expected of her, before his silence could mean anything. Bernard stayed on the balcony for another 5 minutes. The wind, the waltz, the thin scar on the wrist of a woman who had learned to carry everything alone. Dangerous, she had called him. He had spent his entire life being described in many ways: responsible, suitable, an excellent match, slightly closed off at parties, but never dangerous. There was something curiously liberating about that. He went back inside, declined 2 dances with his usual efficiency, and left early, as he always did. And if Adeline Carter's face stayed with him the entire way home, that particular expression when he'd asked if she carried everything alone, the way she had decided not to let it mean anything, well, that was his problem, and his alone. In the days that followed, Adeline was sensible. She was, above all else, a sensible person. She had needed to be from an early age, when her father had died, leaving enough debt to make sentimentality a prohibitive luxury. Sensibility was what had kept her standing, what had paid the rent on time and kept her clients satisfied and done what needed to be done without excessive complaint. Sensibility said, "A duke on a balcony is nothing." Sensibility said, "You have work tomorrow morning." Sensibility said, "He won't think about this again, and neither should you." Sensibility was absolutely right. And then, the following Thursday, Adeline went to the Alderton house to make her weekly delivery, turned the wrong corner on her way out. She was tired, she had slept badly, Sensibility had said nothing about sleeping badly, and walked straight into someone. The basket fell. Freshly laundered white clothes on the stone floor. The particular horror of watching weeks of work potentially ruined in a single second. Adeline dropped down immediately, gathering piece by piece with quick hands, assessing the damage, calculating what would need to be re-washed. "Let me help." She looked up. Bernard Whitmore was crouched in front of her, holding a white muslin blouse with the specific care of someone who had never held laundered muslin in his life, but was making a genuine effort. Adeline stared at him. He stared at her. She was closer than he had calculated. Brown hair, direct eyes, the morning sun over all of it, and Bernard realized with considerable inconvenience that he had stopped thinking about what he was doing. He looked away, back down at the muslin in his hands. This was inconvenient. The basket between them, the white muslin, the Mayfair street with its imperturbable houses and its people who knew exactly where they belonged. "You're holding it wrong, and I appreciate it, but you don't have to do this," she said finally. "I know," he agreed, "but I want to. How do you do it?" And there was something so entirely unexpected about that question, a duke asking for instructions on how to hold laundered clothes, that Adeline had to make a considerable effort not to laugh. She showed him. He repeated the motion carefully. Together, which was a strange word for the situation, but it was the right one. They gathered the clothes from the ground. When the basket was full again, they stood at the same time. Too close to be convenient, too far apart to be meaningful. At least that was what Adeline was trying to believe. "Thank you," she said. "I ran into you," he said. "The thanks goes the wrong way." "I'm fine." "You're not." He adjusted the basket in her hands with a brief functional touch, with no apparent intention behind it. Fine has to actually be fine to be fine. His hands on the rim of the basket, her hands just below. The morning sun on the quiet street. Adeline pulled the basket back to her hip. "I really am fine," she said. "Good afternoon, Duke of Ashbourne." "Good afternoon, Miss Carter." She walked away with steady, purposeful, entirely normal steps, and she didn't think about him until at least the next corner, approximately. Mrs. Belmont had a theory about the Duke of Ashbourne. She laid out this theory on the following Wednesday afternoon, over tea in Adeline's sitting room, which wasn't exactly a sitting room, more of a bedroom with a small table near the window, but Mrs. Belmont refused to let architectural details interfere with socializing. "He's interested in you," she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had treated this as established fact for some time and was simply making it public. "I heard he crossed the entire Whitfield ballroom specifically to stand beside you. That's not a coincidence, darling. Dukes don't do things by accident." Dukes do things out of social obligation, said Adeline, cup in hand, which is not the same thing. You weren't any social obligation of his, then it was curiosity. That either. Curiosity you satisfy with a 2-minute conversation. Mrs. Belmont set down her cup with that particular precision of women who have learned to communicate a great deal through minimal gestures. You know the difference between curiosity and interest? Adeline did, which was exactly why she was calling it curiosity. Mrs. Belmont, she said carefully, the Duke of Ashbourne needs to choose a wife this season. There are at least 10 families in this city with daughters suitable for the title, with dowries, connections, and the right family history. I wash clothes. The arithmetic here isn't complicated. Arithmetic rarely decides these things. In this case it does. Mrs. Belmont sipped her tea with the expression of someone who disagrees but has enough patience to wait for time to prove her point. Adeline looked out the window. The street outside was full of people going places with purpose. She had deliveries tomorrow morning, accounts to close by the end of the week, a future she had built brick by brick with her own hands, one that did not include Mayfair balconies or dukes, with eyes full of genuine attention. When we have no choice, we learn, she had told him. The truth was, she had learned more than that. She had learned not to want what she couldn't have, and she had learned that wanting it anyway was the most efficient way to destroy everything she had built. Another cup, she offered. Mrs. Belmont accepted, with the smile of someone saving her strongest arguments for later. Bernard, at that exact moment, was having a conversation he didn't want to have. It had begun, as most conversations he didn't want to have did, with his solicitor. Mr. Aldgate was an excellent man in his field, precise, loyal, completely incapable of recognizing when the timing was wrong. The circumstances of the estate require a decision before the end of the season, said Aldgate, with the tone of someone communicating something he had already communicated before and was growing mildly tired of communicating. Your father's will was clear. Full inheritance of the Devonshire property transfers only upon marriage. Until then, the interim administrator has authority to make decisions that would ordinarily be yours. I know what the will says. Then you understand the urgency. I understand the urgency, said Bernard. What I don't understand is why this needs to be treated like a commercial transaction. Aldgate blinked. It was clearly a perspective he had never considered relevant to the matter. With all due respect, Ashbourne, he said, with the delicacy used on people who are complicating simple things, it is in part a transaction. One with emotional implications, certainly, but the underlying legal and financial structures— Thank you, Aldgate, said Bernard. Aldgate recognized the signal. He gathered his papers. He left with the dignity of a man who has done his duty and bears no responsibility for the consequences of his employer ignoring it. Bernard was alone in the study. The study window looked out over the Ashbourne estate gardens he had inherited along with everything else, the property, the responsibilities, the unchanging expectation that he would know exactly what to do with all of it. Most of the time he did. He had been trained to know, to assess, decide, act without hesitation. The problem was that none of that training had accounted for a woman on a balcony who called him dangerous, with the same seriousness with which she described a fundamental truth. He looked at the gardens for a considerable stretch of time. Then he did what he always did when he didn't know what to do. He went to work. The trouble with trying not to think about someone, Adeline had discovered, was that the attempt itself was a form of thinking. It was Friday morning, her arms deep in the washtub and her mind theoretically focused on the work, when she realized she had been mentally composing a better response to what he had said on the balcony, a more precise one, less revealing. Sometimes things are how they are because no one thought to question them. She had thought about that, had thought about what it meant that a man with all the authority and privilege in the world found it troubling that things were the way they were, when he was, to some extent, the reason they were that way. She had also thought about his hands on the rim of the basket, about the way that touch had lasted exactly as long as necessary, and not 1 second more, which was the most irritating thing a touch could do. Adeline, her neighbour— Mrs. Marsh's voice came through the window. There's someone asking for you in the street. Adeline looked up, hands dripping. Work half done. Who? Mrs. Marsh had a smile that didn't match the question. A gentleman. It wasn't Bernard. It was Bernard's footman. a young man in a proper uniform who handed over a card with the composure of someone instructed not to have opinions about what he was doing, with a handwritten note on the back that read, "There is a watercolor exhibition at the Meridian Gallery this afternoon. Mrs. Belmont has been invited. Should you be accompanying her, it would be a pleasure to see you both there. No signature." The monogram on the card said enough. Adeline stared at the card for a moment. Then she went to find Mrs. Belmont. The Meridian Gallery was a tall, well-lit space near Piccadilly, its walls covered in watercolors of English countryside, and with a surprising number of people who had clearly come to see less of the paintings and more of each other. Bernard was near a window when they arrived. He saw them before they saw him, or at least before Adeline would admit to having seen him, which was a distinction she was making a point of maintaining. Mrs. Belmont had no such scruples, and crossed the room toward him with the energy of someone who had planned this far further in advance than the card implied. Ashbourne, how lovely. She took his hand with that particular familiarity the very old allow themselves with the very powerful. "I was just telling Adeline that the watercolors in this collection are extraordinary. Do you know the artist?" "Reasonably well," said Bernard. "He's my cousin." "How convenient," said Mrs. Belmont, in a tone that made it perfectly clear she found nothing convenient about it, and considered it entirely her own doing. "I would so love a more technical explanation of that landscape over there." She pointed to a watercolor on the far side of the room. "But my knees are simply terrible today. Adeline, darling, perhaps the Duke could show you the collection while I stay here." As maneuvers went, it was entirely without subtlety. Adeline looked at Mrs. Belmont with an expression that communicated exactly what she thought of that. Mrs. Belmont looked back with the serenity of someone who is 80 years old and has zero regrets. "With pleasure," said Bernard, in a tone that revealed nothing about whether he had noticed the maneuver or was simply choosing not to comment on it. Adeline decided there was a third equally plausible option. He had planned this together with Mrs. Belmont, and both of them were impossible. "Very well," she said. The watercolors were, in fact, good. That was the problem with plans she didn't want to follow. Sometimes the circumstances cooperated in entirely the wrong direction. Adeline had expected to find mediocre landscapes painted by a cousin with better connections than talent, and instead she was looking at scenes of the English countryside with that specific quality of light that only existed on certain autumn mornings, when everything turned golden and slightly unreal, as if the world were showing itself for a moment before remembering to be ordinary. "This one," she said, stopping in front of a landscape with a river and 3 trees that were nothing special individually, but together formed something precise. The painter understood it's not the tree that matters, it's the space between them, or something like that. Bernard was quiet for a moment. "Do you paint?" "No." She didn't take her eyes off the painting. "But I washed the clothes of a painter for 2 years. She used to talk while she worked, and I loved it." "And you listened?" "Carefully. I learn from what I have available." They moved to the next painting. The room around them was full of conversations and the muffled sound of people who knew each other too well or not nearly enough. Neither of them was paying any attention to any of it. "Your mother," said Bernard after a moment. "Is she still in London?" Adeline paused. Not physically. She kept walking, moved on to the next painting, looked at a cottage landscape that didn't deserve the attention. But something stopped internally, like a door she was deciding whether to open. "My mother died when I was 9, she said. "My father died a few years ago. He left debts that took me years to pay off." A pause. "I'm not saying that to be dramatic," she added. "I'm saying it because it's the complete answer to the question." Bernard looked at her with that attention that neither judged nor pitied, which was, she had discovered, far harder to receive than either one. "How long did it take," he said, his voice low, "to finish paying them off?" 23 months, you counted, every single one, and I haven't forgotten how hard it was, how exhausting. And then how free, she said, with a quiet smile on her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories," he said. Silence. Another painting ahead. This one with the sea, this one with more light than the others. This one with something that could be hope or just fog, depending on how you looked at it. "My father died 4 years ago," said Bernard after a moment. She hadn't expected that. "He left an estate, responsibilities, and a will that made marriage a condition for full inheritance." A minimal pause. I counted the months too. Adeline looked at him. It was the first time he had said something that made him smaller than the title. Not diminished, but specific, real, carrying the kind of weight people carry when there's no alternative. That explains the rush for a wife, she said. Partly. And the other part? He looked at the painting with the sea. That sometimes what you're supposed to do and what you want to do start to feel like different things, he said. And you don't know exactly when that happened. Adeline was quiet for a moment. The room around them, the voices. His cousin somewhere, probably receiving compliments. That's dangerous, she said finally, the corner of his mouth. You use that word with me often, he said. Because it's accurate, she answered, frequently. They stayed at the exhibition for another hour, and neither of them noticed the time passing. Mrs. Belmont, whose knees had apparently recovered with remarkable speed, circulated through the gallery with the independence of someone who had fulfilled her purpose and was now enjoying the rest of the afternoon entirely on her own terms. No one commented on the fact that Adeline and Bernard spent that hour side by side, speaking quietly about watercolors and about things that were not exactly watercolors. Or perhaps they would. Perhaps they would comment later in other rooms, with the kind of precision that rumors acquire when there is enough interest to fuel them. That Adeline didn't know yet. What she did know was that there was a difference between the version of Bernard Whitmore she had constructed, the Duke, imposing and distant, belonging to a world that wasn't hers, and the version standing beside her now, who had counted 23 months of something of his own, and who looked at seascapes the way someone looks when they recognize fog. That second version was the problem, because the first was easy to keep at a distance. The second was specific, real, and had the inconvenient property of mattering. At the exit, while Mrs. Belmont went to retrieve the hat she had left somewhere strategic, Bernard stayed beside Adeline near the door. "Will you be at the Harrington concert next week?" he asked. "I wasn't invited," she said. "Mrs. Belmont was." Adeline looked at him. "You have a suspicious amount of influence over the invitations Mrs. Belmont receives," she said. "I'm a friend of the Harrington family," he said, with no sign that this should be embarrassing. "And Mrs. Belmont deserves more invitations than she gets. That's very noble of you. It's practical." He looked at her directly. "I'd like to continue this conversation." The directness was unsettling. It was easier when there was subtext to hide behind, when things were said obliquely and could be received obliquely, and no one needed to name anything. "You know this will generate talk," she said. "I know. And even so." "And even so," he confirmed. Adeline looked at the door, at the street outside with its people who knew where they belonged, at Mrs. Belmont making her way back with the hat and a smile that wasn't trying to hide anything. "Well," she said, finally. "Then perhaps Mrs. Belmont could use some company at the Harrington concert," and she walked away before the smile she was trying not to make could fully happen. Almost. The Harrington concert was a mistake, not the concert itself. The music was good, the room well lit, and Mrs. Belmont had run into 3 people she hadn't seen in months and was genuinely happy, which made the evening justified on entirely independent grounds. The mistake was of a different nature. The mistake was Lady Margaret Holt. Adeline hadn't known her by name until that night. She knew the type. There were several of them in the season. Women with old family names and appropriately veiled ambitions, and the specific ability to make other people's presence inconvenient without saying anything that could be directly objected to. But Lady Margaret had a particular refinement to it. She didn't humiliate. She simply arranged the social space so that certain people ended up on the outside, as if the room itself were rejecting them. Adeline realized she was the target when the space around her began to reorganize. It was subtle. A conversation that stopped when she approached. A group that closed slightly without any apparent hostility. A remark that it was rather warm in that corner, perhaps they should circulate. And the group circulated, and Adeline remained where she was, alone in a way everyone could see, but no one had caused specifically. She was used to this. It was different from Mayfair, more elaborate than the blunt rudeness of the girls in the Pembroke garden, but the feeling in her chest was the same, the reminder that belonging is a privilege that must be granted, and that she had not been granted it. She was looking for Mrs. Belmont to say she'd step outside for a moment when she heard Lady Margaret's voice, clear and measured, addressed to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. Ashbourne is becoming eccentric, they say, inviting just anyone everywhere. Not that it's our concern, of course. A light pause. Though it is a bit awkward for everyone involved, wouldn't you say? Quiet laughter. The kind that doesn't implicate anyone. Adeline went very still. There was a list, she had learned over the course of her life, of possible responses when someone did this. She could react with dignity, which would be read as excessive sensitivity. She could ignore it, which would be read as confirmation. She could leave, which was exactly what they expected. She was calculating between the options when she felt a presence beside her. Bernard had crossed the room. She hadn't seen him move. He was simply on the other side. And then he was here, at a distance that was too close to be casual, and far enough not to be scandalous. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm. "Have you tried the punch?" "It's decent." It was the most ordinary thing anyone could have said in that moment. It was also, given the position he had taken in saying it, a declaration. The silence in Lady Margaret's corner had a different quality now. "I haven't," said Adeline, in the same tone. "Then allow me." He took a glass from the nearest footman's tray and handed it to her with the ease of someone who does this every day, with everyone without distinction of origin. "Harrington has a contact in Portugal. The wine is worth the trip." And he stayed beside her, not for 2 minutes. He stayed for the rest of the concert. And when the group around Lady Margaret tried to rearrange the space again, the space didn't cooperate because there was a duke in the middle of it, and dukes had their own social physics, as he had said once without using exactly those words. Later, near the end of the evening, when Mrs. Belmont was saying her goodbyes to someone, and they found themselves alone for a moment in a small alcove near the window, Adeline said, "You knew this was going to happen." That the punch would be decent? Yes. Bernard. It was the first time she had used his name. It came out before she could stop it, and hung in the air between them with a weight neither of them pretended not to feel. He looked at her. "I knew Lady Margaret would be here," he said, "and I have a fairly good idea of what she does when she's bored. And you invited me anyway." "And I invited you anyway." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Inside, the final movement of the piece was drawing to a close, and the candles cast long shadows on the white walls. "Because you shouldn't have to stand outside of anything," he said, with a simplicity that made the words heavier than they would have been with more of them. "And staying silent about it was something I'd already tried. It wasn't working." Adeline looked at him. The concert ended. Applause from the room. Mrs. Belmont appeared at the back, signalling she was ready to go. "This is going to generate more talk," said Adeline. "Probably. Lady Margaret won't—" "Lady Margaret," he said with a firmness that was new, that she hadn't heard from him before, "will not determine what I do." Adeline looked at him for a long moment, at that firmness, at the brown eyes that didn't look away. "Good night," she said finally. "Good night." And she left, and the night was cold, and she walked the 3 streets home with the wind in her hair and the glass of punch she had left behind, and the feeling that something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could name, but shifted. And that was enough to be unsettling. The talk arrived in 2 days. Adeline heard it on Tuesday morning, from the Alderton cook, who was as efficient a source of information as any newspaper, and substantially less discreet. The information was this. There was speculation about the Duke of Ashbourne and a young woman of unknown origin who had appeared at 2 recent social events in the company of Mrs. Belmont. The speculation said the Duke had shown interest. The speculation also said, here the cook lowered her voice with the specific pleasure of someone saving the best for last, that Lady Margaret Holt was furious. "Furious how?" asked Mrs. Hobbs, who was present and had her own interest in the matter. "Furious like someone who had plans, and someone came along and ruined them," said the Alderton cook with satisfaction. Adeline signed the delivery receipt and left with the empty basket, and a new worry settled in her stomach. It wasn't Lady Margaret's fury that troubled her. It was something else, more specific, more uncomfortable, the feeling that something was happening around her that she hadn't consented to and couldn't control, that the world was reorganizing itself around a narrative that included her name, in ways that could have real consequences, and that she had, somewhere between the Pembroke garden and the Harrington concert, stopped asking herself whether she wanted any of this to be happening. That was the most frightening part. Bernard discovered there was a problem on Thursday. The problem arrived in the form of a visit from his uncle, Lord Ashcroft, who was the kind of man who never visited without something to say, and who always had something to say that Bernard would have preferred not to hear. "I need you to understand the position you're in," said Lord Ashcroft, seated in the study with the posture of someone who had rehearsed the line before saying it. "Lady Weston mentioned it to Lady Preston, who mentioned it to your mother, who mentioned it to me. There is a young woman of very modest origins who has been appearing at events in your company. Ashbourne, you need to choose a wife this season. The Pembrokes have a daughter, the Aldertons have two, the Holt family—" "I know which families have daughters," said Bernard. "Then act accordingly." Lord Ashcroft placed his hands on his knees with the firmness of someone who believes the matter is settled. "Whatever this attention you've been giving this young woman is, end it, before the situation becomes difficult to manage." Bernard was quiet for a moment. "With all due respect," he said, with a calm his uncle likely recognized as a warning, "you have no authority over who I invite to events." "I don't. But your reputation is perfectly intact. For now." His uncle stood. "Think carefully, Bernard. You have obligations. To the title, to the estate, to the family. A woman who washes clothes has no place in any of those obligations." Bernard looked at him. There was a response he wanted to give. It was direct, it was final, and it would end the conversation in ways that would have lasting consequences. He felt it in his chest, fully formed, and then he thought of Aldgate, and the will, and 23 months that weren't his, but whose weight he recognized. "Thank you for the visit," he said. Lord Ashcroft left with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has done his duty. Bernard stayed in the study, the window, the gardens, the estate he had inherited, and the responsibility that came with it, and the will that made everything conditional, and Adeline Carter's face that had appeared in the middle of all of it, without asking permission, and refused to leave. He tried to work. It didn't work. The Devonport gathering was technically a casual affair. Gardens, open-air music, the kind of afternoon London pretended to be relaxed without quite managing it. There was less formality than at the balls, which meant more circulation, more impromptu conversations, more opportunity for things to happen without the framework of social ritual. Adeline had almost not gone. She had spent 2 days thinking about the rumours, about the growing visibility of a situation she hadn't planned for, and that had the potential to complicate practical things, clients who listened to gossip, a reputation that in her world depended on being discreet, the difference between being seen as a woman of character and being seen as someone who had tried for something above her station and failed. She had spent 2 days being sensible. And then Mrs. Belmont had appeared on Wednesday afternoon with 2 hats to choose from, and the expression of someone who was not leaving without a satisfactory answer, and Adeline had thought, one last time, and then she would be properly sensible. The Devonport garden was crowded when they arrived. Too many people, too many flowers, the late afternoon sun making everything look more golden than it was. Adeline stayed beside Mrs. Belmont, conversing when necessary, observing when it wasn't, trying not to look for anyone specific in the garden. It wasn't working. She saw him near the fountain, somehow too tall for the garden, as if the space weren't quite adequate for him. He was in conversation with 2 older men, his back to her, and then something made him turn. Not her, she had been careful, and their eyes met across the distance of the garden. He didn't smile. She didn't smile. Just that extra second. That time that wasn't necessary and happened anyway. And then Lady Margaret appeared. She emerged from the wrong group at the wrong moment, or perhaps the right moment, depending on who was doing the planning, and said, loudly enough to be heard by everyone nearby but with the casual tone of someone not doing anything in particular, "Oh, the beggar from the Pembroke garden. What a surprise to find her here as well." A smile that wasn't a smile. Ashbourne's tastes are becoming ever more democratic. The garden went very quiet. Not the whole garden, it was too large for that. But the section around them did, and that section included enough people for the silence to mean something. Adeline felt the heat rise up her neck, felt the perfect Pembroke garden, and the roses no one had planted with their own hands, and the basket too heavy, and the low sun and all the years of work that had bought her dignity, cent by cent, now being used as a punchline by a woman in immaculate gloves who had never needed anything. She opened her mouth, and then Bernard arrived. Not crossing the garden, he was already close, had moved before Adeline noticed. He was beside her now, and there was something different about him that she identified in under a second. The composure was gone. Not dramatically, not with visible anger, but there was something in his shoulders, in his jaw, in the way he looked at Lady Margaret, that was completely unlike the man with the quiet voice on the balcony, in the alcove, at the gallery. "Lady Margaret," he said, with a stillness that carried more weight than volume. "You're being inconvenient." Lady Margaret blinked. "I'm simply—" "You're calling a woman a beggar in a garden for the second time," said Bernard. "The first time I wasn't close enough to respond. Now I am." Total silence in that section of the garden. "If she's a joke," he said, his voice low and absolutely steady, "then none of you know how to recognize value when it's standing right in front of you." And then he did something Adeline hadn't expected. He took her hand, not with calculated gentleness, not with the subtlety of a functional or accidental touch. Firmly, like someone who has made a decision and will not undo it. Adeline's hand in his, in front of everyone gathered in the Devonport garden that afternoon. Adeline didn't pull her hand away. She couldn't. The garden around them held the specific silence of a world being reorganized. Lady Margaret's expression mixed shock and humiliation, and something that was clearly the beginning of a carefully planned fury. And Bernard stayed where he was, Adeline's hand in his, looking out at the garden with the calm of someone who has just crossed a line and has no intention of crossing back. "We should go find Mrs. Belmont," he said to Adeline, his voice steady. "We should," she agreed, and they walked through the garden together, her hand in his, while the garden decided what to do with that. Mrs. Belmont was drinking lemonade with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with lemonade. Adeline released Bernard's hand when they reached her, not abruptly but with a clear intention. Mrs. Belmont pretended not to notice. Bernard pretended that her pretending not to notice was appropriate. "Time to go?" asked Mrs. Belmont, in that tone of someone who is 80 years old and in absolutely no hurry, but is asking out of politeness. "I think so," said Adeline. Bernard stayed beside them while they collected their hats and said their goodbyes, and when they reached the garden gate he said, "I can have a carriage brought around." "That won't be necessary," said Adeline. He looked at her. There was something he wanted to say. She could see it in him, the sentence formed but not delivered. "Adeline," he said, using the name she had used first, which he now used as if it had always been permitted. "Good night, Bernard," she said. And she left with Mrs. Belmont, and the sun was setting over the Mayfair rooftops, and the hand he had held still felt the weight of it in a way she couldn't resolve. Behind them, the Devonport garden was processing what it had witnessed. Ahead, Adeline Carter was processing what she had felt. And somewhere between the two, there was a decision that needed to be made, one she had been putting off, and that the garden, with her hand in his in front of everyone, had made urgent. The question was no longer whether she felt something. The question was what to do with it, now that she could no longer pretend she didn't. If you've made it this far, you already know you're lost, just like Adeline. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what comes next will break your heart before it puts it back together. You've been warned. The rumors arrived before Adeline had time to prepare for them. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation, the Alderton cook, then the laundress from the parallel street, then a new client who had mentioned it with the specific care of someone who wants to appear to be helping, that she had heard a laundress was circulating at season events in the company of a duke, and that it was generating talk in the drawing rooms, the kind of talk that sticks. Adeline heard all of it without responding, but there was one thing different from all the others, something that hadn't come from gossip, but from a letter. The letter arrived on a Monday, unsigned, in small, precise handwriting, and it said the following. The Duke of Ashbourne was pressured this week to formalize a proposal to the Holt family. Word is he has agreed to consider it. A laundress who imagined otherwise would do well to consider her own situation more carefully. Adeline read the letter twice. She folded it, tucked it in her pocket, finished the morning's work, 4 baskets, 2 deliveries, a new client in Belgravia who paid promptly and asked no questions. She did it all with her usual precision, because precision was what remained when everything else came apart. And then, alone in her small room with the window facing the street, she sat for a considerable stretch of time thinking about one single thing. I knew. Not the letter itself. She hadn't known about the letter. But the conclusion. She had known from the beginning. She had known in the Pembroke garden on the Whitfield balcony, at the Harrington concert and the watercolour gallery, and in every conversation that had lasted longer than it should have. She had known and stayed anyway, because he had said things that made you want to stay, and because there was a difference between knowing something with your head and believing it with the rest of yourself. Now both parts were aligned. She picked up her coat. Bernard was in the study when he received word that a Miss Carter was at the servants' entrance asking to speak with him. He went immediately, which was, in retrospect, the first sign that he was losing the clarity he had maintained up to that point. Dukes did not go immediately to servants' entrances. Dukes sent footmen with messages. But he was at the servants' entrance before he had properly thought about it, and Adeline was there in her usual coat and her usual eyes, and an expression he had never seen on her before. Closed. Not hostile. He had seen her hostile, had seen that cold dignity when the girls in the garden mocked her. This was different. It was the face of someone who had made a decision and was following through on it. "Could you receive me for a moment?" she said, her voice calm. "It won't take long." He took her to the library, not the study, which was the territory of obligations, but the library, the only room in Ashbourne House he had chosen for his own taste rather than by inheritance. Adeline walked in, looked at the shelves with a brevity that suggested she would have looked longer under different circumstances, and then turned to face him. "I've heard," she said, "that you're considering a proposal to the Holt family." Silence. Bernard went very still. Not because the statement was false. It wasn't entirely false. There had been a conversation his uncle had started, and that he hadn't ended with the necessary firmness, because he had been busy avoiding ending things that implied other things. But it wasn't true in the way she was saying it either. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter who told me." Her eyes were direct, without accusation, and that was worse than accusation. "What matters is whether it's true." "It's not true the way you're saying it." "Then how is it?" He opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer was, there was pressure and I hadn't confronted it directly, and there was a reason for that. It has to do with responsibilities and wills and a world that existed before you walked into it, and that keeps existing regardless of what I want. The honest answer was long and complicated and true and completely insufficient in the face of her eyes. "There is pressure," he said. "That's true, but I haven't made any proposal." "You will." "I don't know what I'm going to do." "Bernard." Her voice didn't waver. He almost wished it had. "You have obligations. To the title, to the estate. I know that. I've always known that." A small pause. "What I shouldn't have done was forget it for a while." "Adeline." Dreams weren't made for people like me. The words arrived without drama, said in the same quiet voice as everything she said, as if it were a practical observation, like the arithmetic in an account book. And for that reason, it was impossible to argue with, because it wasn't anger or bitterness, it was simply her believing, with complete sincerity, what she had learned to believe. He took a step toward her. "That's not true." "I'm fine," she said, and it was a lie. And it was the same lie as always, the same one she had told the Pembroke housekeeper and Mrs. Belmont and herself every morning for years. "You were—" She stopped for a second, and it was the only second in which her voice faltered. "You were very kind to me, and I'm grateful, but I need to be sensible." "Adeline." "Wait." She didn't wait. She left before he could respond, as always, as she had done since the Pembroke garden, as if leaving first were a protection against something she couldn't name but recognized by its weight. Bernard stayed in the library, the shelves, the books, the window with the gardens beyond. There was one specific thing he had done he understood in that moment, not a large thing, not a deliberate betrayal, but a thing of omission. He had let the pressures exist around her without confronting them, because confronting meant choosing, and choosing meant consequences he hadn't finished calculating. And while he calculated, she had received a letter that did the math for him. That was, in its way, the worst kind of mistake, not what you do, what you fail to do. The days that followed were the longest Adeline had spent in a very long time. She washed. It was what there was to do, so she did it. On Tuesday morning, her arms deep in the washtub with steam rising slowly in the cold room, Mrs. Marsh appeared at the window with a basket of linens and the smile of someone who had come to talk rather than to help. "I heard you've been turning up at season events," she said, setting the basket on the floor without ceremony. "With fine people." Adeline didn't stop washing. "I have," she said. "And how was it?" "Fine." Mrs. Marsh was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that precedes an opinion no one asked for. "You're a good girl, Adeline," she said finally, in the tone of someone who genuinely believes they're being kind. "Hard-working, honest, but those things—" She made a vague gesture toward the world outside. "They're not for us. They never have been. My mother said so, and her mother before her. You learn it early or you learn it late, but you learn it." Adeline looked at the water. "Was your mother happy?" she asked. Mrs. Marsh blinked. "She was settled," she said after a moment. "She knew what was hers and what wasn't." "Settled," Adeline repeated. She wrung the sheet with her hands. The water ran cold over her wrists, over the thin scar, down to the stone floor. Mrs. Marsh left shortly after, with her basket and the satisfaction of someone who has performed an unsolicited duty. Adeline was left alone with the steam and the cold water, and the linens that still needed washing. She washed, and thought about settled, and how differently that word weighed now than it had weighed her entire life. At night, alone, she thought about things she shouldn't think about. She thought about the watercolor gallery and the painting with the river and the 3 trees, and him saying the painter understood it's not the tree that matters, it's the space between them. And then she corrected herself. She had been the one to say that, and he had gone quiet in the way of someone recognizing something true. She thought about his hands on the rim of the basket, about the Devonport garden, about the firmness with which he had held her hand in front of all those people. She thought about dreams weren't made for people like me, which she had said as a practical truth, and which he had received as if it were a wound. And there was a part of her, small and stubborn and entirely inconvenient, that thought, what if I was wrong? What if Mrs. Marsh was wrong? She pressed that part back down to where it had come from. It worked, for approximately 15 minutes. Bernard went to see Lord Ashcroft on Thursday. Not because his uncle had asked. He hadn't. He was waiting for Bernard to arrive at the correct conclusion on his own, which was Lord Ashcroft's preferred method of handling situations. Bernard went because there was something that needed to be said, and the only way to say it was in person, to someone who represented the full weight of the expectation he had been carrying since he was 22. "I will not be marrying Lady Margaret Holt," he said, seated in his uncle's study with the posture of someone who is not asking for permission. "Nor any other woman I would choose out of obligation, rather than reason." Lord Ashcroft looked at him for a long moment. The will is fulfilled when I marry, it doesn't specify to whom. Bernard, your social standing can be managed." He didn't look away. "I have spent years managing obligations. I know how it's done. What I don't know how to do is keep pretending there isn't a difference between what I owe and what I want, and that the difference doesn't carry real weight." Silence. Lord Ashcroft had the expression of someone who recognizes an argument he won't be able to refute and is deciding whether to try anyway. "This woman," he said carefully, "you understand what it will mean?" "I do. Talk, resistance. The entire season will—" "Adjust," said Bernard, "or it won't. Either way, it will be my decision, and what people think no longer concerns me. What matters is my happiness, and I know exactly where that is." He left with the feeling of having finally said the sentence he had been forming for weeks, and that arriving late at a conclusion didn't make it any less true. The problem was that Adeline didn't know any of this yet. She was on Alderton Street when he appeared. Adeline had finished her delivery and was heading home with the empty basket when she heard the footsteps, fast, purposeful, entirely inconsistent with the rhythm of the street on that Saturday afternoon. She turned. Bernard was half a block away, coming toward her, without a formal coat, without the social framing of any event or ballroom. Just him, on the street, moving with the speed of someone who had made a decision and was following through before he could change his mind. Adeline stayed where she was. "Walk away," said the sensible part of her. "Now. Before he gets here and says something you can't ignore." She stayed. He reached her and stopped at a distance that was too close to be casual and that neither of them did anything to increase. He was slightly out of breath. He had walked fast, clearly, or run, which was an idea she filed away immediately because it was impossible to think about without consequences. "You left before I could respond," he said. "I'd said what I needed to say. I have things to say, too." "Bernard, I went to see my uncle," he said. "I told him there is no proposal to the Holt family. There isn't going to be one." A pause. "I told him the decision is mine." Adeline went very still. "That doesn't resolve—" "It doesn't resolve everything," he agreed. "I know that. There are things that will be difficult. There are people who will have opinions. There is an entire world built around certain expectations that will not reorganize itself easily." He took a small step toward her. "But none of that is reason enough." "For what?" "To not say what's true." He stood there, looking at her with that attention she had learned to recognize and had never been able to defend herself against. "You told me once that I was dangerous because I talk as if things could be different. You were right, and the specific reason things can be different is that I found someone who made me want them to be. The street around them kept existing. A woman with a basket was passing on the other side. A horse, the afternoon sun on the rooftops." Adeline looked at him and felt the stubborn, inconvenient part of her, the one she had been pressing back down for days, rise with a force she no longer had the energy to contain. "You know who I am," she said. "What I do, where I come from. I know. And you're here anyway. And I'm here anyway." He raised his hand and touched her face lightly, the first touch like this, without function, without practical justification, just the palm of his hand against her face on Alderton Street on a Saturday afternoon. "That's the most remarkable thing about you, Adeline, the ability you have to bring life to places where it seems there's nothing at all." She looked at him, his hand on her face. The street, the sun. There was a version of this scene where she said something sensible, something about time, about difficulty, about the arithmetic that hadn't changed just because he had gone to see his uncle. She knew that version. She had been living in it for years, the version where she made peace with what she could have and didn't want the rest. And then there was this version. "Nothing is more truly ours than our dreams," she said quietly. Not to him, to herself, to the part of her that had held that as truth since always, and now needed to hear it said back. He said nothing. He looked at her with eyes that understood more than she had said. And then Adeline Carter, who had learned to be sensible since she was 9 years old, who had carried heavy baskets and paid other people's debts and kept her dignity intact in the face of perfect gardens and immaculate gloves and an entire world that made her invisible, made the most senseless decision of her life. She stayed. And when he kissed her, she felt his hands first, one still on her face, the other finding the rim of the empty basket, as if he instinctively knew what she always carried. The sun was warm. The street was quiet. And Adeline Carter, who had learned that the world asked little of her beyond work and silence, realized she was crying, not from sadness, but the kind that comes when something you didn't know you'd been waiting for finally arrives. She didn't leave this time. And it was worth every year of waiting. The street kept existing around them. Someone certainly saw there would be talk. Neither of them did anything about it. The world didn't reorganize itself easily, as Bernard had predicted, but it reorganized. Lady Margaret was vocal for 3 weeks, until the intensity of her own fury began to reveal more about her than about Adeline. When someone needs so badly for another person to be unworthy, people start to wonder why. The noise faded without anyone needing to silence it. His uncle arrived eventually at a distant neutrality that was the best possible outcome under the circumstances, and Bernard accepted it for what it was. Enough. Mrs. Belmont attended the wedding in a hat she had purchased 3 weeks before the formal proposal, which said everything about her and nothing she didn't already know. 6 years later, the Devonshire estate was larger than Adeline had imagined when Bernard first described it to her. Not that he had described it poorly. He had been precise, as always, about the dimensions and the fields and the main house and the gardens that ran down to the river. But there was a difference between hearing the description and standing on the terrace in the September dawn, with the mist still low over the grass and both children asleep upstairs, and the tea going cold in her cup because she had stopped drinking it to look out at the fields. It was the kind of morning that made people believe in things. She had learned in the 6 years since Alderton Street that there were different kinds of difficulty. The first year had been the loudest. The talk, the refusals, the invitations that never came and the ones that came with conditions attached. She had learned to tell the difference between genuine hostility and temporary discomfort, and had found that most people, exposed to a steady and unshakable presence, eventually adjusted. Bernard had been unshakable. That was the thing she hadn't fully anticipated, that the steadiness he had shown in the Devonport garden wasn't a moment of impulse, but a character trait. That when he said something was his decision, he meant it, and that the weight of other people's opinions, though real, had no authority over him. It had taken her some time to learn to let that be true without waiting for it to change. The second year had been quieter. The third had brought their eldest, Clara, who arrived in the world with the specific temperament of someone who already has opinions about everything and intends to express them, which left Bernard with a permanent expression of quiet pride. The fifth year brought their son, Thomas, who was calmer, who observed with his father's eyes before acting, and who had spent his first year of life being carried by Adeline with the efficiency of someone who had carried heavy baskets, and therefore understood that real strength was a matter of practice. The hands marked by work, which some had considered inconvenient for a duchess, were the same hands her children reached for when they slept. Adeline had thought about that many times. There was a letter in the corner of the bedroom writing desk that she had kept for 6 years. The anonymous letter that had arrived before the library, before Alderton Street, before everything. She had kept it not out of resentment. Resentment had been a brief and inefficient visitor, but as a reminder of how things had been, of the distance between that afternoon and this terrace. Every now and then, when the ordinary of daily life made the extraordinary invisible, she opened it, read the 2 sentences, folded it back. She had spent her whole life believing her dreams were too big, until someone proved they were exactly the right size, and she remembered what it had cost to believe she was allowed to stay. Bernard's footsteps came up behind her. She recognized them before she fully heard them, a sense she had developed in the first months of marriage and never lost. He came out to the terrace with his own cup, saw hers had gone cold, and swapped them without comment because 6 years had taught him that she stopped drinking her tea when she was looking at the fields. "Clara's up," he said, in that specific tone of a father communicating a fact and a request for help at the same time. With what opinion? About breakfast, and about the order in which things ought to be done, and about Thomas, who is apparently doing everything wrong. She's 5 years old. She's 5 years old with the convictions of someone 3 times that. Adeline smiled at the fields. Bernard stayed beside her, and for a moment they just stood there, the warm tea, the mist, the children upstairs starting the day with the energy of people who don't yet know the world can be hard and don't need to yet. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered the question for a moment. "Heavy baskets," she said. He looked at her. And how strange it is," she said, looking out at the fields, the mist, the gardens running down to the river, "that carrying everything alone for so long was what made me capable of being here." Silence. Bernard set his cup on the terrace railing and looked at her with that attention that hadn't changed in 6 years, the same as in the Pembroke side garden, the same as on the Whitfield balcony, the same as on Alderton Street, with his hand on her face, and the decision made. "Nothing is more truly ours than our dreams," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. It was the first time he had used the phrase. She had said it to herself on the street, in that moment. She had thought only she had heard it. "You heard that," she said. "I heard everything," he said. "I always have." From upstairs came Clara's voice, clear and decisive, announcing something about eggs that required immediate attention. Thomas responded with the kind of sound that meant peaceful disagreement. The house woke up around them, with the specific noise of a life that had been built, brick by brick, by the hands of two people who had learned, one sooner, one later, that things could be different. Adeline picked up the warm cup he had brought her. She drank the tea before it went cold this time. And then she went to tend to her children, with the Devonshire fields behind her, and the mist lifting slowly over the grass, as it did every morning, as it would tomorrow. Ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, the way only things that cost something real to have ever are. If this story touched something in you, subscribe and share it with someone who also needs to hear that dreams were made exactly the right size. Thank you for being here from the beginning. Until the next story. The End.